Are we giving in to evil? Oh, yes, we are. In part two, we looked at the city of Minneapolis and the official invitation to criminals to steal and loot. Citizens have been officially commanded by the police to do what the thieves tell them to do, to surrender private property, not to resist. The city has hereby joined the trend to model civic cowardice. And it is a trend. It didn't just originate in Minneapolis. It's a trend that is sweeping the entire West. They have joined the trend to participate in a culture of total appeasement and an appeasement with evil in the same ways that Portland, Seattle, and hundreds of other cities are dealing with evil. They're giving up. They're giving in to evil, using the powers of government to punish and harass and terrorize law-abiding citizens who simply expect and still want to have a law-abiding government. And I don't mean abiding by fake law and unjust law. They really want to abide by the true law that's been established over centuries. And they expect to have a law-abiding government. And why do they expect it? It is because for centuries this expectation was developed into a framework of civilization. Civil government was developed to be the organizer of order and the organizer of justice and the enforcer of unchanging law, that higher law, that's real law. And the civil government was to be a continual and dependable force of restraint against evil, to stand up against it, to look it in the eye, take it by the throat, and get rid of it. And that's what the civil government was meant to do for the rest of us, and we trusted them to do it. They were to be there to define evil accurately from generation to generation, century to century, and to define the just punishments for expressions of evil. Never any punishment that didn't fit the crime, nothing too harsh and nothing too lenient. And it took centuries for us to figure a lot of this out and to write it down into our books of law and have that available so that judges could learn from precedent and from previous cases and how other judges had wrestled with some of these cases to try to get it right, because we wanted to get it right and preserve it and then pass it on to our children and the people who would be the civil magistrates for our children's generation. And so this is how it developed. We had a culture, and our culture protected this high moral ethic over time. Countless families and towns and villages and cities gradually adopted traditions of law and order and preserved them and wrote them down and then valued these as a life and death affair. Only death cultures throw away civilization and turn governments over to criminals. And this is what we're now seeing after centuries of building, a culture of life and justice and liberty. We've got a death culture now. And that's what we and our children are seeing develop. Instead of using the legacy of higher law to resist or eliminate evil, officials are defending evil. They're blaming victims as causes of evil. They're attacking their own culture as the source of evil, their own Western culture as the source of evil. In the same way, the rule of law became established by widespread practice over time. The rule of law can be annihilated by widespread neglect, and there can be a trend that just sweeps the world, just widespread neglect. And that's what all these different cities are looking at, and they're following the trend to be popular and to be woke and to do what these other cities are doing. The protections that are due citizens by an oath of office are being removed from the citizens, and then those protections are being placed over the criminals. So this is how, right now, we're shocked to see justice is being inverted. It becomes injustice. It's being turned upside down. New categories of crime are being created, not by elected officials who pass legislation, but by the fads and the fashions of pop culture and politically correct dogma. And in the new culture of appeasement that I've been talking about, citizens who expect law and order are really the problem. They become the problem. They are a problem in the mind of this new culture of appeasement, because law and order deprives a criminal of something he wants. And so he is therefore the victim of citizen oppression. And this is how innocent citizens can become guilty of committing an offense if they just dare to confront or oppose or offend this lawbreaker. Offended lawbreakers are somehow then labeled as oppressed persons, victims, traumatized by people who become automatically guilty of being oppressors. And so ethics is discredited and evil is elevated to a form of protected cultural expression. Let me say that again. When ethics are discredited, then evil can be elevated to a form of protected cultural expression. And now today, many criminals in all these cities that we've been talking about, they know that they'll never be prosecuted, but rather stand a really good chance of getting superstar treatment in the media and by woke little groupies who line up to confer on the offenders this new sort of moral prominence for having the courage to attack the laws of Western cities. And this virtue of courage, which was a virtue for centuries, and we knew what it was, it's being twisted now into a vice. It's now fashionable to publicly take the side of civilization's destroyers. And just look at the phone videos of recent protests. A special superhero sort of status awaits all these destroyers of historical monuments and the attackers of peace officers. Witness the young men in spandex suits and masks running around at night like comic book characters, displaying their prowess to the female social justice warrior, showing off his twisted version of courage. And without resistance from authorities, crime like this does become a game or a livelihood or a courtship ritual. What are these young people doing with the, coffee houses and restaurants are all closed. They say, hey, let's get together out here at the protest, at the riot. Join me for the riot. Let's see how many more businesses we can destroy tonight. Small businesses. Burn them to the ground. Beat our record from last night of X number of millions of dollars in damage. See if we can do the, This is where they're creating a new cultural meeting place. Now, does it really? This raises a question. Does it really take any courage to attack the Western tradition when the attacker can expect emotional cheers from the emotional mob and maybe, favor from this female who's been watching him, and he can expect cheers from government agencies? This word is out. The word is out now beyond many national borders that crime is a good paying gig, a really good paying gig. You violate immigration laws just by coming to these cities that tolerate crime so generously. What do you get? You don't get deportation. Illegals get free housing at upscale hotels. They get free phones. They get unlimited internet. They get a protected status when it comes to defying local laws. They simply have to plead cultural ignorance of our laws and stand on the cultural traditions of their own lawless ways as the proper way a primitive or a woke society should live. And they just say, well, you have to let me live the way I want to. I'm not going to assimilate. I'm not going to learn your ways. I'm not going to respect your laws or obey your laws. I'm going to join the mob in tearing them down. And this is how mobs develop and surrender to the mob. And this culture of surrender to the mob, it spreads like a disease from city to city and across national borders. The lawless congregate and they tear society down together. The newest members of the mob, who are now often upscale yuppie types with six-figure salaries, like those of the Occupy Wall Street movement, are making new demands on the authorities. They insist on special protection for criminal offenders. And why is this? It's not because they are in moral crusader mode and they've got this new morality that they want to pass on and create. Here's why. And in the last episode, we talked about the fear of the authorities and the fear of people. It's because these people who are joining the mob are now in survival mode. And listen to this line of reasoning very carefully. They really are terrified of criminal subculture. And they know they will never have protection from their rulers. Nobody's going to be there to help them. No one's going to come to their aid. The policemen are being defunded. They're quitting. Nobody's going to come to help them. And so in order to survive, what do? Well, you've got to, and this is what happens in a lawless society. You try to buy some favor from the criminals somehow. And the quickest and easiest way is just by joining the gang. Hey, bro, don't steal from me. I'm on your side. See, I got the same clothes and the same flag and the same tattoos and all this, and I know the chants, and I can riot. I got the same spray paint. I can prove that I hate law and order just as much as you do. Let's be bros. That's what we want, right? A place where there's no law and order, but only the rule of organized criminals deciding on who belongs to the mob and who's the enemy. Let's do this together. And they're doing this, and it really is survival mode. Because what happened? What else can you do if you're totally outnumbered and no one who is in authority will protect you? And they're turning society over to the criminals to actually run the society. If you're a woman, or if you're weak, or if you're small, and you have no weapons, the only way to survive is to surrender yourself to the authority of the mob and hope they don't kill you. And when the mob gets big enough, the authorities themselves live in terror, and they join up too, throwing more shade to the criminals, hoping that they, the traitorous rulers, will be considered woke enough and cool enough and hip enough to be killed last. But I have to say, sorry, Mr. Mayor, it just doesn't work that way. The criminals will never stop hating you because they know you're a traitor to the law, and you will just as easily betray them. And you've just emboldened the mob to burn your house down and hang you from a lamppost, and the mayor of Seattle learned this the hard way just recently. And this is why policemen are running scared too. When the criminals get so much momentum and force, and the appeasement culture is sweeping the land. Rainier Wendt, head of the German police union, said every police officer knows that he has to meet a particular political expectation, meaning he's got to show himself totally politically correct to keep his job. And then Wendt said this, it's better to keep quiet about crime because you cannot go wrong, meaning you cannot be found out to be politically incorrect. You cannot criticize the criminal. You can't make an arrest where you're going to mess up this appeasement culture. And so if you break the politically correct expectation he's talking about, you're wrong. You're politically incorrect. You lose your job. Police in Rotherham, England, refused to prosecute known prostitution rings involving underage girls because the criminals were foreign and of darker skin color than the average Brit. And to arrest and prosecute and protect the girls would have labeled the policemen racist, or at least they feared that they would be labeled racist by the criminals and would lose their jobs. And so they stayed quiet, like, the policemen in Germany are doing. And because of this culture of surrender that has so badly infected police in the United Kingdom, one parliamentarian who really wanted to look into this, Jane Champion from this area of Rotherham, investigated and finally, after investigation, estimated that as many as 1 million British girls have been victimized by kidnapping, criminal gang rape by religious gangs, while policemen knew about it and remained quiet and turned blind eyes to it for fear. And many of them, and I've been studying this and reading about it, the criminals would just come up to the cops and just say, hey, you say anything and we'll kill you. And so the policemen were terrified of these gangs, which were growing stronger and stronger. And so they were afraid of being called racist and losing their jobs. And they've confessed to that. But they were also afraid of just even being killed by the criminals. And so could it be that as many as 1 million girls, not just in that one village, of course, but across central and southern England, and Miss Champion, what happened to her for reporting this and bringing this to light and doing her investigation and going public with it? Well, she was removed from her office by her political party for bringing the reality of these crime rings into the public eye. It was an embarrassment to the party, which wanted to be politically correct and have the favor of the growing politically correct criminal mob who could still vote. And, even this is really astounding. After this news broke, what had happened? And the politicians and the policemen who had been tolerating this in this one district, they had an election. And, watching from the United States, I thought they were going to vote everybody out. But the politicians just simply promised more money and more welfare benefits and more subsidies to those little small businesses and the families in the area, and they kept those politicians in. And so in an appeasement culture, you don't have true courage to stand up to criminality, to resist it and destroy it and get rid of it. You corrupt yourself and you go along with it. It really truly corrupts the entire society. And then it begins to corrupt the individual souls. And we've seen that with the policemen. I mean, they are really a corrupt bunch and a cowardly bunch. Another story. Here's a story of a courageous policeman. Swedish police officer, Peter Springer. He was himself reported to police investigators for being racist and has been investigated. After what? After he said the country's gang rape problem is linked to a particular group of migrants and was a cultural phenomenon. And he had all the data on that to show exactly what was going on, by whom, and who was committing the crimes, how many there were, where it was happening. He took all the stuff that had been covered up and simply brought it out to the light. And the media was horrified that he told the truth when the entire culture, this appeasement culture, was living this lie. Springer tried to change that. And he was so vilified, he left the force in frustration. And now up to 80% of the police force is considering leaving. Swedish Police Sergeant Peter Larsson said the Swedish authorities now face all these horrendous, overwhelming crime challenges with ever-decreasing number of officers. And Larsson warned that we have a major crisis. Quote, "We have a major crisis. Many colleagues have chosen to leave. We will not be able to investigate crimes. We have no time to travel to the call-outs that we are set to do. A worsened working environment means," and this is still his quote, "that many colleagues are now looking around for something else," end quote. In 2017, Swedish Chief Prosecutor Lisa Tam stated that the Stockholm suburb of Rinkeby was like a war zone, and that police work there was more like the work of the armed forces. And people who haven't really been to Sweden, I was there not too long ago. It really is like this, and there are no-go zones, and there are war zones in many of these cities, and there are numerous killings and rape. I mean, Sweden really is the rape capital of the world now, and it's not getting better; it's getting worse. And many of the police, and I have documentation for this, have been going around to many of the neighborhoods that they simply cannot cover anymore because of the lack of manpower, and telling residents of entire neighborhoods, look, we're sorry. There's no way we can respond to any of your calls anymore. It's up to you to protect yourselves. You need to organize yourselves into some kind of neighborhood watch group. You need to collect for yourselves certain kinds of weaponry to be able to defend yourselves, because you cannot depend on us anymore. We're too short-staffed. And there are girls who've called the police and just said, look, I need to report a rape. Can I file a report and file charges? And the police say, look, we don't know when we'll ever be able to get out to see you to take a report from you. This is how bad it's getting in places like this. The absence of law, the absence of order, and when anyone with a sense of justice and right and wants to stand up against it will simply be destroyed. If he does end up quitting either the judiciary or the police force, and so the innocent are even more in danger. Here's another story. In other jurisdictions, police work has simply become a pragmatic appeasement with criminals, because they don't have enough forces. They don't know what to do. They basically are just doing a dance with the criminals. Hey, look, we'll sort of leave you alone if you just try to behave yourself. I mean, what else can they do if they can't arrest, if the courts can't convict, if the prisons are full, there's no place to put these people. It's almost like the authorities are begging them on their knees to please don't commit so many crimes. Please, we won't provoke you with laws or with accountability to laws. Just stop doing what you're doing. A blonde Austrian girl was sexually assaulted by 4 criminal migrants, and the police report noted that a police report was taken with this girl. And the report said the attack began with one assailant putting his hands through the girl's hair. And so the police just went to the girl and said, hey, look, can you please just dye your hair? I mean, they didn't know what else to, well, of course they knew what else to do, but they are appeasing the criminals. The system is letting everyone down. And so the people are enslaved to the forces and the power of the growing criminal element. And so the police are basically just having to say to citizens, look, you really are just going to have to try to avoid the criminals. They're everywhere. They're falling on you every chance they get. You're just simply going to need to try to stay out of their way, or you will be victims of crime. In Cologne, Germany, migrants gathered together and they used their phones to organize a meeting. You can call it a meeting. It was an assault. It was an organized assault one night to sexually assault and harass more than 1,000 German girls on that one night alone. So what was the next day? What was the mayor's response? It was to blame the girls and to tell the girls to dress differently and to keep migrant men an arm's length distance away from them, as though this is all we can do. And so the city, they talked tough again. They printed up these little pamphlets that show you how to put your arm out at arm's length and keep a man away from you, thinking that this is how we deal with crime. We're tough on crime. This is what we're going to do. Do you see the insanity of this? And, and what happened to the 1,000 attackers? Well, out of the 1,000, only 58, were ever even arrested. And 2 were convicted in court, and they received sentences of 1 year, being 1 year in prison, which was, nothing for what they had been doing and what the crimes that they had committed. But they received suspended 1 year sentences, which means they were just turned immediately back onto the street. The other 56 who were arrested, all criminal proceedings against them were stopped, and they were released back onto the streets, which means all 1,000 of the attackers are still on the streets, doing what they want to do. In Sweden, another story. Classmates gang raped a 14-year-old girl in the boys' room. And yet they remain enrolled because the principal says, of course, rapists are victims too. Quote, rapists are victims too. And the verdict said, we need to keep them in school because they have a, quote, impaired ability to understand what is right and wrong. And of course they have an impaired ability. Everybody has an impaired ability. What has impaired their ability to understand basic morality and ethics? It's super simple. Evil is celebrated. Evil is defended. Evil is rewarded in thousands of cases that these kids can read about on their phones. In how many jurisdictions do they ever read about crime being accurately defined and swiftly and consistently punished? I mean, if you don't have any examples of that, you're going to have a trending culture of appeasement that continues to sweep the land. Now, if there were any jurisdictions that were standing up to crime and doing the right thing and doing it boldly and doing it consistently and doing it with moral authority, and the results were a downward trend in crime, Other cities would be looking at that. There would be citizens saying, you know what, we need to vote into office people who are doing what they're doing in that city. And you could turn the situation around, and there would be a new, different trajectory of culture when it comes to the management of civil society, the management of crime, the dealing with crime. The cultural response to crime in an appeasement culture will always be similar to this other case. And this, again, is another one that just continues to drag the world downward and backward. A 16-year-old girl was trapped and then abused and then stabbed and then murdered in Sweden. And the young murderer was arrested. He was brought to trial. But the police commissioner himself, the one that all the policemen and the judges looked to, he was the highest-ranking police officer, got up publicly. His name was Dan Eliasson. And he followed the PC script to turn the criminal into a victim. And so in a whining and apologetic voice on national TV, he urged citizens to remember this, all the trauma that the poor murderers suffered, having to look at all that blood and the gore at the scene of the crime, which was like, a horror movie or something. But it was what he himself had committed. But the police commissioner was saying, we need to be sorry for him. We need to see him as a victim. We need to see him as traumatized. And therefore, we need to go leniently on him because he's a victim. And so Dan Eliasson said nothing in that particular appeal, that whiny little appeal about the victim and her family and her life and what had happened to her. And so the more appeasement there is, the more terrified people become of the entire culture and even one another. And the more afraid people become of confronting evil and punishing it, denouncing it, and defending foundations of law and order. For countless years, new citizens of the United States who were naturalized are required to promise when they take their oath of loyalty to their new country. They're required to promise to defend their newly adopted nation, even by force of arms. It's just required of them. If you're going to be in our country, there are things that will be required of you. You've got to keep all the laws of our country. That's one of them. You need to defend your country and what we've built here in terms of our legal system and everything else. More than 15 million legal immigrants have been naturalized during my children's lifetimes. And they pledged to defend America, even with the force of arms. But then, during President Obama's administration, he ripped this defend part out of the oath of allegiance. It didn't go through Congress, as it was supposed to have. He just did it himself. And this is nothing more than giving in, another example of giving in to evil, from the highest executive office in the land. And so it spreads everywhere. And if the people with the authority, the governors, the legislators, the police commissioners, the presidents of the United States won't stand up against it, the trend really snowballs. We now let enemies of all kinds trample what was once a civil, orderly society based on the rule of law. And so now criminals, traitors, invaders, outlaws of every kind, they just get their way. And all of us are expected to do as they say. And so until we resist, this makes them the established source of law in our cities and across the nation. If you have any questions about this line of reasoning, these facts, and some of the solutions that can be pursued, especially through governors of states, please do write to me. I want to hear from you. I want to know your thoughts. Give me your thoughts on what we do about evil, what you've observed in your cities. And you can write to me at questions@geoffreybotkin.com. I look forward to hearing from you.
If you like content like this, please consider subscribing. If you know others who would benefit from this material, please share it with them. To connect with us directly, please visit geoffreybotkin.com and send any questions or thoughts that you might have to questions@geoffreybotkin.com.